Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here with Charlene Scime, who's up there in Niagara Falls. Beautiful place, by the way. And she's going to talk a little bit about how her family migrated from Sicily. So thanks, Charlene. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I always start out when I'm doing people who are doing research with the question of why and when did you start researching your family?
I started in maybe 2007. I was in Florida. I go to Florida for the winters, and our local computer group was doing a class on genealogy, so I took it, and I was hooked. So that's where I got started.
Yeah, we all get hooked up. Both your parents from Italy or just your father's family?
My father's family's from Sicily, and my mother's family's from Calabria.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I have some great grandparents from Calabria. So let's start with Dad's family. What town in Sicily, and what have you found out? That's interesting.
Um, they were from a little town called Villalba, and I think it's in the middle of Sicily. I was there, but I don't remember exactly where it was. And what I found out was when my great grandparents had their first two children, one of them was having trouble standing up in her crib and whatever. And they had some family in Trenton. And the family in Trenton told them to come to the US to see what was wrong with the little girl. And my grandfather came over, and he sent for my great grandmother and the two children, and she was treated for polio in a New York hospital. And they stayed because they could not have gotten the health care or anything like that in Sicily. So they stayed and made a life in the US and ended up coming to Niagara Falls. Um, Niagara Falls is a huge Italian population. It's the largest ethnic group in the city. And there were all sorts of I don't know, like carborundum and graphite plants and stuff like that. So there was a lot of work here for the men to do. So that's why they ended up here, I guess.
So now that's interesting. That he was able to bring the family over with one of the children being sick with polio, and that they didn't stop them or stop her.
Right. I think because she was so little, she was still being held. And so they may not have known. She was like a year and a half or two when they came over.
Oh, so maybe that's it. They didn't realize that she was actually, and they probably, in those days, they probably couldn't test or wouldn't know. Yeah, my mother's oldest brother, when my grandparents came over, they left him behind in body. And uh, I've heard two stories. One was that they were going to eventually go back to Italy. And then the other story I heard, they were going to bring him over. But in any event, he wound up staying there um, through his youth. And when he wanted to come, he had turned 18 and he couldn't. Oh, wow. For two reasons. One is he had to serve in the Italian army. And the second reason was he couldn't come under his parents anymore. He had to come as himself. And so he raised his whole family there. They spent the war years there. So all my cousins were born from that. But one of my cousins, and maybe she was 5 or 6 at the time, she had a liver disease. And when my uncle was going to come with the whole family, they couldn't because she was sick, and they may have had a problem anyway at Ellis Island. But she was sick and she couldn't come, and that ship kind of sailed. And then the quote unquote businessman from Canada, Toronto, I think, or in the Toronto area, came across looking for people to work on the mushroom farm. And the town collected money, sent my uncle over by himself. and they had to spend 5 years in Canada before they came over. But you'll love this story. My Their oldest daughter came to see her father and stay with him in Canada, and she was 18, not having a very good time of it. She was a young girl living in a boarding house with all men. Of course, my uncle was there, but still. And my mother's oldest sister and her husband went up to visit in Canada, and she was crying and saying she didn't like it there and everything. And my uncle said, "Get in the car." And they rigged up a fake seat for her to hide under the back seat, and he drove her over the bridge.
Not an unusual way to get over, because I'm right on the border, and I guess there's all kinds of stories of people crossing the border that way.
Yeah. So then eventually she met her husband in America, and of course she couldn't marry him because she wasn't legal. So she had to go back and apply, and then eventually everybody came over and everything was fine. So they came to Newark, and so your grandfather then worked in one of these mines or whatever. Is that what he did?
They're like chemical plants or carbon products plants in Niagara Falls. There was a lot of plants built up because of the water power from the falls itself. So there were a lot of industrial. It was very industrial.
And so what year was that when he?
1908, maybe, when they got here.
Oh, so they got here pretty early then. Mm-hmm. Yeah. My two families came in like 14 and 15. So that was pretty early on. Yeah. So you went back to the town. When did you go back, and what was that like?
I was there 3 years ago. I went to Italy on a painting trip, watercolor. I was learning watercolors in Venice. And I was there for a week, and I decided to extend my stay for 2 more weeks. And I traveled by myself in Calabria and Sicily, and I was able to meet second cousins on both sides of my family. So it was awesome. But I did go back to the little town in Villalba. 2 of my cousins from Niagara Falls decided to come over there and meet me, and we all went to the town together. And it was just awesome. We had to go through a dirt road to get there, like a really ruddy dirt road, and a flock of sheep. And it was very, very, very rural. And a cousin of a cousin showed us around. And she was awesome. She brought us to her house. She cooked us a big meal. It was fabulous.
Yeah, and there's so many stories like that. We were supposed to be there in April. We had gone 25 years ago, 24 years ago, whatever. And I hadn't done my research, and I really didn't know anything. And we went to Rome, of course, and then down to Sorrento. But my dad's mother, her family all lived on one of the main roads in Naples, Via Carbonara. And I didn't know at the time that the train station was like a half a mile from where they all lived. And, obviously we didn't go, and we were supposed to go. And I've since found, some third and fourth cousins from that family. And we were going to have a big lunch, and there are houses there that we were going to go to and everything. So we're hoping now maybe by May we'll get there and do that whole thing. But I have heard that, people, they really treat you like a long lost, cousin,
and you are.
So did they ask you a lot of questions about America?
Not in that town, because we only have one relative left there, and she was an older lady. But when I left there, I went to my dad's father's side of the family. And he would always say that there were 13 of them in their family. And we didn't know if it was 13 children or 13 with the parents or what, but only 4 came to the US. And all the rest of the family was left in this little area in Castelvetrano. It's in Trapani, the province of Trapani. And when I went there, we had a huge dinner with all the cousins that they could find that were related. And we were all second cousins. So when we took pictures, I looked like that side of the family. Like you could tell that I belonged to that part of the family. So it was very interesting.
Yeah, and I found that with exchanging some of the photos of my dad's mom. My dad had a very square chin, and everybody in that family has that same chin. And my sister gets mad at me because she says the Sorrentino chin, and I said no, it's the Piramalo chin. It's our family, not his dad. But yeah, when you start seeing that stuff, it is truly amazing. So your mom is her family's from Calabria. What part of Calabria?
Right. They're from, it's a town called Pianagrati, and it's in Cosenza. Um, and it's also a very small town. And there I saw where my grandfather grew up, where the family lives. They still all live together in the same building, sort of like an apartment building. And that was a very interesting place to visit also. I have second cousins there, and they did the same thing. They came out from all over the place. They were 60 miles away and still came to visit. So, but I had heard when my cousin went there in 1975, the internet wasn't around and whatever, and he had written letters saying that he was going to visit the village. And when he got there, he stopped at a little restaurant, and they asked him who he was. And once he told them, I guess somebody made a phone call, and the whole village, the whole family came out and met him in the square. And it was just really, it's just so exciting.
Yeah, and I've asked a lot of people the same question about that. What did they think and how did they feel? And most of them said the same thing. They didn't. I mean, we didn't know they existed, and they certainly didn't know we existed. So to make that connection, and there's always, I think, one or two in the family that you connect with over there. Like I found one third cousin over there who's, I wouldn't say that she's into the genealogy bit that much, but she's very excited about knowing, who was here. And my dad's, actually both my dad's parents, my dad's father came over and his brother came over, and I think they had 3 other siblings. They all stayed. And on his mother's side, only my grandmother and her aunt were here, and her aunt was here first. So there's virtually no Piramalos that migrated to the United States. So, and there's actually nobody with that name here that I know of, because only 2 women came.
That's how it is in Pianagrati, where my grandfather's from. Our last name was Infelice. And there is no trace of his family there because the 2 brothers came here and the sister stayed in Calabria. So, and she had just girls. So we're just, that name doesn't exist there. I mean, it might from another family, but not from ours.
But not from your family, yeah. So now, have you done a DNA test?
I have.
Yeah. So what, did you find anything interesting with the DNA other than knowing you're Italian, of course?
No, well, as far back as I can go, I'm Italian. And as far back as my kids can go, they're Italian. And that's pretty far down in generation to still be full Italian. Actually, my kids are more Italian than I am because their father, I guess, was more Italian. But no, I'm 96% Italian, and the other part was like Turkish. And the interesting part was my grandfather used to always say that pianocrati used to be it means flat ground or something, and the nomads would come over through there and stop in pianocrati and then go back to Turkey and wherever they were from. And so it just made so much sense when I got the DNA back that that was the part that was mixed in.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah, that's interesting. The one thing that bothers me about these DNA tests is that they all start fiddling with their algorithms, and you're one thing one day and another thing the next day. And, sometimes I'm, 85% Italian and sometimes I'm 65%. I mean, I've been able to trace, especially my dad's mom, back centuries and centuries and centuries. So I know where the mix comes from. And sometimes it shows up and sometimes it doesn't show up. I always look at it this way, there's DNA and there's culture and heritage, So
Right.
you could be 100% Italian in culture and heritage, but you may be only 50% in DNA. And I try to explain that to my family sometimes, saying that it's not going to be what you think it's going to be. We're not all going to be the same, and it's not all going to pop up the same way. But I think it's interesting that your kids show up
more Italian than I am. I know. And my brother, he's like 95% Italian, and then his extra little parts are totally different than mine. Like mine's Turkish and all in that area, and his is more toward the Greek area because he's picking it up more from the Sicilian side than the Calabria side. And the way it was explained to me is you get 50% of your DNA from your mother and 50% from your father, and all the little parts that they are, like maybe the Italian parts are all red marbles and all the other parts are different colored marbles. So when they put them all together, those little marbles come out different. So that made sense. I guess I'm a visual person, so that made sense to me.
No, I am too. And there's, I did a little thing on it, a blog post on it last year, I think it was. They call it the jelly bean test. And you put a bunch of different colored jelly beans in a jar, and you pick out your jelly beans and I pick out mine, and they're going to be completely different.
Right.
And
but the bulk of them will be there.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So. I may have 20 red and you may have 10 red, and I'll have 30 green and you'll have 15 green and things like that. And that's when I saw that, I went, oh, now I get it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And my percentage has changed over the years. I think I started out at like 84%. But then it said like the smaller parts, they're starting more to combine them into, okay, so now this goes to the Southern Italian and this goes to whatever. And so it's like tweaking it a little bit more or something. Do you know what I mean?
And there is, I found them last year. There's a really interesting site, and they have various levels that you could pay for to get more and more information. But the initial one is free. It's called My True Ancestry.
Oh.
And what they do that is pretty neat is they compare your DNA to archaeological digs.
Wow.
So, for example, they can tell you going back 20,000 years that your DNA sample has traits from, let's say, Roman warriors or something like that. And they give you a timeline that shows through history how you match up to these things. And it's really, I think it's more directional than anything else, but it's pretty neat. And I know it's accurate because, I've done mine and my wife, and my two children are adopted. So obviously we don't share any DNA. And you could see for each person how the differences are. And the other one that's neat, if you haven't done something similar, is living DNA, because they give you your maternal line and your paternal line. So just for example, my mom, my maternal line is almost 96% from the Caucasus. No hint of any Southern European or anything. And my paternal line shows a migration path through Romania and into the Swiss Alps and into Sardinia. So it's pretty interesting to see where you originally came from, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. So they're two pretty cool sites, if you ask me. And I've been trying my best to get some of the Italians to do it. I haven't had any luck yet. So I think if we do go, I'm going to buy a few kits and bring them over there and make them spit into the thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, I know we're related because I've seen all the documentation, but it wouldn't be nice to have that connection,
Yeah, I don't have any relatives over there who've done it. So
and I asked a couple of people, and they said they don't have to really, because they pretty much know where they come from. What I found is interesting, because my wife is half Puerto Rican, half Sicilian, and my son's birth father was at least part Puerto Rican, and they do it by the ton. I can't tell you how many matches my wife has. Tens of thousands.
Wow.
And I can't figure out why. I mean, it may be because the culture is so varied there that people want to know, well, am I how much Spanish am I? How much Indian am I? How much,
Right.
So my wife has part, American Indian, Taino, I think it's called. And she's obviously got Spanish, and she's got some Norwegian thrown in there. And we can't figure out if it's coming from the Sicilian side or from the Puerto Rican side.
Right.
And the same thing with my kids. So how far have you been able to get back then with both families?
I'm back to maybe the late 1600s. Yeah, that's, and I'm slowing down because it's like I don't care too much after that. Not that I don't care, but I mean it's just going to go back the same path. But Ancestry, now they've got that through lines. It is, and it seems to be connecting more of the dots, and then it'll say like you've got, I don't know, 26 matches for this certain person, and it, not that I want to put them all down because I want the documentation, but it's makes it a lot clearer than it did 2 or 3 years ago. So
yeah, and I do like those features that they add like that. They kind of give you some really good insight into everything. And yeah, I found some things through there. I also found, and I did one interview with somebody from Family Search, and they're free, and they give you a lot of great tools. And I didn't know that they're the ones who are actually doing all the filming of all the records. And they said they are trying to start to branch out to trying to get some church records on there too. And they said it's hard because they have to make contracts with people and do all of that kind of stuff.
Right.
So I know all of us who did this are driven in a certain way. What's what does your family say? What do they think when you find things? I know my family sometimes interested and sometimes they're like, so what?
We'll be right back.
Lafayette, we are here. The French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman. Learn all about France's fascinating history, its great characters like Charlemagne, Joan of Arc, Louis XIV, or Napoleon, but also the great events that marked France, Europe, and sometimes the whole world. Lafayette, we're here. Available wherever you get your podcast or on LafayettePodcast.com. À bientôt.
I have, luckily, a cousin on one side of the family and a nephew on the other side of the family that are interested a little bit. So I at least know my research is going to go someplace. But I have an aunt who is 92, and the Sicilian part is her side of the family. And I'll talk to her and she'll say, "Oh, that's nice, honey, but why do you want to know that?" She just doesn't get why. I said it's because it's like a mystery. You're discovering things, and she doesn't see any need for it. But, for my kids took the DNA because they said it was my hobby and they did it because I wanted them to do it. And, but they've had some interesting contacts with people who are cousins on their dad's side that we didn't know that there were cousins on the dad's side from one of the uncles. So they've had some contact with that. But, it's interesting. I love it.
And and to your point, it is like a mystery. It's a little bit Sherlock Holmes in there, and people ask me why do you do it, and I said the same thing. It's a challenge. I said, and when you find that thing that you're missing, it's just amazing. Like I had my grandmother's grandmother on my dad's side. Her last name, she's not Italian. She was Swiss. Her last name was Moore. And I was like, I'm never going to find anything with this woman. This is going to be impossible. And I was just researching through, banging around on Google, and I came across a book, I guess it would be, or documentation on the officers in the Neapolitan Army in the 1860s. And I found my grandmother's grandfather, and just in the same section where he was, it said there was a Bernardo Moore who was a captain with the Swiss Guard.
Wow.
So I was like, Swiss Guard, I always thought they just took, they guarded the Pope, right? But apparently especially Lucerne, they would contract themselves out as mercenaries to the Neapolitan army. So I found this guy, and then I'm banging around again, and I came across a site that said, if you want to know anything about Swiss genealogy, you could write us in Italian, English, or German. So I sent them an email, and they sent me a link to all the prominent families in Lucerne, of which Bernardo Moore came from. And I was able to get her families back to the 1400s.
Wow.
All through this link. So for anybody listening who's not sure, you got to keep banging around. You never know what you're going to find. And sometimes you have to walk away and get a break.
Oh, for sure. The only thing is when you walk away and you leave your notes and you go back to them like 3 months later, you look at them and say, where was I going with this?
Yeah, that's funny. I've been there. I know exactly what you mean. Like, what was I thinking with this?
I know.
But I found some interesting things with my daughter, because she wanted to meet her birth parents, and they've been in the country. Their family's been in the country since the beginning, pretty much. And I was able to trace her back and found out that one of her great grandfathers was Daniel Boone.
Wow.
Another one was Captain Morgan.
Wow.
And she's a distant cousin of Princess Di.
Wow.
And she's a descendant from an Italian family, the Bassano brothers, one of the Bassano brothers, who I never knew who they were. They were musicians to the court of Henry VIII.
Wow.
And they went from Italy to London and stayed there. So,
That's amazing.
who would ever know that going back to this 1400 or something like that you would find this. So that was all, pretty interesting. I told my daughter, you're a descendant of Daniel Boone. She said, who's that? I was like, kids.
Perfect.
But so it's, like I said, for advice, don't give up, keep looking, you'll find something out there. So anything else that you found that was interesting?
No, we went to, what I did when I went through Italy was I contacted my cousins on the different sides of the family, and I told them from the US, and I told them what I was doing. And if they wanted to meet me over there, they could meet me. I told them my agenda and, where I was staying. And so, a brother and sister and their spouses met me in Calabria. And we went to my mother's side of the family. And it's Decolatura, I think is the name of the town. Decolatura. I'm not sure where the accent goes. And Cerisi around in there. And so we were able to walk through the cemeteries. And it was like they had dug up, I guess, graves, and each family had like a little mausoleum that was above ground. And they put the remains in those mausoleums. So you could walk in or at least look through the door and see maybe 10, 12, 15 little plaques in there. And we saw all the names of all of our ancestors, like the last names. We didn't find our actual ancestors, but we found all the names. And it was just so interesting to like walk in their footsteps in the town. Like you knew that they lived there. That's where they walked. So that was probably the most interesting thing to me, is just to see where they were and be where they were.
Yeah, and that's what I told Cinzia. I said, I want to go to cemeteries. I told my wife, I said, you could go take a tour someplace if you want. I want to go to the cemeteries. But, my grandmother's side, my grandmother comes from nobility. So that some of the houses and things are still there. Like the town hall in Capricota was my third great grandmother's home.
Wow.
So her father was the Duke. She later became the Duchess. And in Calabria, there are still a couple of houses that are there. They're Piramalo residences. Unfortunately, no longer owned by the family. I think there's a place in Ischia that is still owned by someone in the family. So yeah, we were going to be going to all of those places and doing all of that. And yeah, I know one of my cousins went. She went, I think, in the summer or spring of last year, before all this nonsense started, and she was in Naples, and she was telling me we were just walking around Naples and seeing, the family name here and the family name there. And she's only half of the connections. My grandmother's grandmother was extremely well connected. I mean, back to pretty much all the royalty of Europe. And so I watch these TV shows sometimes now, and I say to my wife, well, he's a relative and he's a relative. And I tell her, I said, if my father knew any of this, there would be no living with him at the time. But I asked my cousins who live with my grandmother, and she didn't talk about it. And that's one thing that seems to be common throughout everybody I talk to. The grandparents really didn't talk about Italy that much, even when questioned. Some people said I actually asked my grandparents, and they said, I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah. My mother's family, I knew a lot of their history. I guess because it was through the girls and they would talk and, sit around and say stories. But my dad's family, even though I live in Niagara Falls, my great-grandparents were here. All of my cousins were here. We didn't know any of their history at all, why they came to Niagara Falls, why they were here. But each family had a little piece of it. So about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, they were working on these books called The Italians of Niagara Falls, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3. And the local historian, the Niagara Falls historian, was asking for stories. And so I told her I could write a story. So I contacted all of my cousins, and we sort of got together and fit the pieces together. And now we've got a complete story of what they did when they were in Niagara Falls. There was even one point where I guess the women would go over to Niagara Falls, Canada, and pick tobacco. Like, why they were growing tobacco over there, I don't know, but they were at a tobacco farm. And they would be like the workers that would, clear the fields, and then they'd come back over to the U.S. side. And, so there was all the little tidbits that each family knew their own little history, but none of us knew the whole thing. So that was kind of interesting to put it together.
If you still have the story, send it to me. I'll put it out there.
Okay, I will. Yeah,
I'll put it on the blog post. That would be really interesting. Yeah, I found out last year that my cousin from my oldest uncle, before my uncle passed away, he interviewed him in Barres, and I never knew about it. And I said to him, Joey, I said, you have to translate this. This is like the family history, because, like I said, they were there till 1950. And he said, I tried once and I couldn't get through it. It was just too tough when I listened to it. And I like begged him. So finally he sat down with his sister, one of his sisters, and they translated it. And it was this amazing snapshot of life in Bari from around 1915 to 1947, 1948, and, his time in the army and how he met my aunt and where they lived and World War II and all of that kind of stuff. And, if it wasn't for the internet and doing all of this stuff, that story would have been lost forever. I mean, even down to what they would eat and, what their house was set up like. And my uncle, my great grandfather owned a cow, and would walk the streets of Torito with my uncle and the cow. And if you wanted milk, you bring out your pail, he'd milk the cow, and that was how he made his living.
Oh my goodness.
And I spoke to my oldest cousin from that family, and I said to her, did you know him? Did you know our great grandfather? And she said she did. And she said he was very old, but I remember that he always used to bring a little piece of candy. That was, I guess, his thing with the kids. Right. He would bring a piece of candy. So, those stories would be gone and lost forever if there weren't people like you and I trying to find this out.
My grandfather wrote, he came over here when he was 12, and he went back when he was 72.
Wow.
And he would write to his sister back and forth, and, he's the one from Pianacrati. And so he knew about the family and what the family was doing. But when he went back in 75, I guess 72, 75, he wrote letters to my parents and he wrote letters to me. I was in college. And so I saved his letters and my mother saved his letters. And I found them a few years ago and read them. And he did the same thing. He described the house that he was born in, and he went and asked the people if he could go in and look at it. And they let him go in and look. And, he described what the house was like and how it was different from what he remembered. And he would talk about his nieces going to school and the troubles that they were having going to school, and that he could look out the window and see the next village. And he was describing the village. It's awesome stuff. And I'm glad I had that. And so that's, that when you have stuff like that, it makes you want to see more or want to know more.
Yeah. And it's, it's a connection to it's, it's who you are.
Right.
In a sense. And I don't know. I have a tough time on trying to figure out why people don't understand us.
Well, you know what I think it is too? If your family ended up in a place where there was a lot of ethnic, what do I want to say? Like identity. So Niagara Falls has a huge Polish and Italian population. So the Polish people in Niagara Falls are still really connected to their Polish roots, and the Italians are still connected to their Italian roots. But I think if you moved to your family was in a place like down in Florida, nobody says that they're Italian, or they don't have that ethnic identity, I guess. So I think it's the generations. If you're in an area where they still identify with their culture, you tend to keep it a little bit longer than you do if you're in a place where people are more transient, I guess.
Yeah, and everybody's so spread out now. And when we were kids, everybody lived within a few. At one time everybody lived next door, and then it was a few miles, and then it was 20 miles, and now it's hundreds of miles in some cases. So,
yeah.
But I guess that's progress. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, this has been great fun. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I love doing these stories and hearing other people's, how they made their connections and everything. So
sounds good. Thank you very much.